We all know about the Cold War, the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, a war that was not really fought on the battleground, but fought on economics, political, and technological fronts.
But have you ever heard about Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, who used his reforms and policies to single-handedly end the Soviet Union? But to understand all this, we must start with Vladimir Lenin and how he created the Soviet Union. In October of 1917, Lenin and his comrades overthrew the government, made the country communist, and pulled out of the First World War. He then started a 3-year-long civil war, also known as the Russian Civil War, where anti-communist whites fought against pro-communist reds.
Lenin eventually died of a hemorrhagic stroke in 1924, though his legacy still remains. Following Lenin's death in January of 1924, Stalin took charge. Stepping into office, Stalin implemented his 5-year plan changing the country from agriculture-based to industrial-based. Life under the Soviet rule was as hard as ever, and anyone who dared oppose Stalin would be hanged or be sent to Soviet work camps.
Then the Nazis attacked the Soviets in World War II. Mikhail Gorbachev was born around this time, in a village called Privolnoye.
At the time of his birth, Privolnoye was divided evenly among the Russians and Ukrainians. Gorbachev's family was both Russian and Ukrainian. His paternal family was Russian and his maternal family was Ukrainian. His paternal family had migrated to the regions of Voronezh several generations before, and his maternal family had migrated from Chernihiv. Gorbachev's village was immediately under Nazi attack. His village did survive, but Gorbachev's father was wounded in action. Then America dropped their atomic bomb on Japan and World War II came to a close. It was time to establish a new world order, and the USSR was put in charge of Eastern Europe. Stalin proceeds to set up a communist puppet government, which were established in the east, as a buffer zone between the USSR and the west. With barbed wires being put along the borders, Churchill proclaims that an Iron Curtain had divided the continent in two.
The curtain has descended across the continent.
Then America announced the Truman Doctrine, condemning the USSR and stating that America would try to prevent the spread of communism around the world. Many people view this as the official declaration of the Cold War.
In 1949, the USSR acquired their first nuclear bomb, meaning America no longer had an edge over the Soviet Union.
Back in Asia, the People's Liberation Army defeated the Republic of China, who fled to Taiwan, and the now communist China signs a mutual defense treaty with the Soviet Union. Back in America, fear was starting to take hold during the McCarthy trials and the Red Scare, where many were imprisoned and even executed for being communist. Then Stalin dies and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, denounces Stalin and goes on a campaign of de-Stalinization.
At this time, Gorbachev earned a silver medal from graduating high school and was accepted to Moscow University and graduated in 1955. At the university, he was granted full membership to the Communist Party, and after he graduated, he became assistant director of propaganda for a local communist youth league. It was at this time he met his future wife Raisa and brought her to his village.
Tensions between America and the Soviet Union increased when both sides upgraded to hydrogen bombs, which were 10 times more powerful than atomic bombs. America freaked out when the Soviets launched the first satellite, and again when they sent a man into space. Tensions only got worse when the Soviets shipped missiles to Cuba and America was completely vulnerable to the missile attacks. This was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the closest America had came to nuclear destruction. Thankfully, though, an agreement was made with American missiles out of Turkey and Russian missiles out of Cuba. America breathed a huge sigh of relief.
After his initial job, Gorbachev quickly rose through the ranks of the Communist Party, and in August of 1968 he was named Second Secretary of Stavropol Kraikom.
Just a year later, in 1969, he was elected Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union.
Then tensions got worse again where America began involvement in the Vietnam War, where America was trying to stop the spread of communism throughout Asia. Thousands of young Americans were sent into the thick forests of Vietnam to fight an enemy that used the jungle as their shield.
Tensions between the Soviet Union and America were further increasing, and it seemed like nuclear war was inevitable. But then, Mikhail Gorbachev came into office.
Succeeding Konstantin Chernenko, Gorbachev became the youngest man ever to become General Secretary of the CPSU. In May of 1985, Gorbachev gave a speech where he admitted that the Soviet economy wasn't the best and that there were inadequate living standards.
Gorbachev brought in glasnost and perestroika, otherwise known as openness and reconstructing, with measures that were considered bold at the time. Perhaps the most important of these reforms was that it allowed foreigners to invest in the Soviet Union.
What was different about Gorbachev from previous Soviet leaders was that his philosophy differed a lot. He wanted the Soviet people to be happy and wanted to have greater freedom in the Soviet Union.
People could criticize the government and the Soviet people had more freedom.
He would later make a positive relationship with the West. This resulted in the INF Treaty, which stated that, quote, each party shall eliminate its intermediate-range and short-range missiles. At this time was also when Gorbachev appointed and dismissed Boris Yeltsin, a later rival of Gorbachev.
Also at this time was when Gorbachev tried to improve relations with America. Reagan was president at the time and was at first distrustful, but after a few meetings, his tone towards the Soviet Union was starting to soften. Reagan also visited China, becoming the second president to do so since Nixon's visit in 1972.
In Eastern Europe, people were still unsure what the new reforms would mean for them. Would they be oppressed as they had been for decades? Or could they finally gain their freedom? And that was exactly what the Hungary's prime minister asked when he met with Gorbachev.
Gorbachev said he didn't agree with it, but he wasn't going to stop it either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its future. This was huge. Hungary began by planning multi-party elections, and Poland followed suit.
Hungary's barbed wire border also began falling, and the Iron Curtain was starting to unravel.
Not only that, but the Berlin Wall that divided the Berlin people for so long had finally fallen. A year later, Germany would be reunited.
Elections in Bulgaria and revolutions in Czechoslovakia and Hungary brought an end to communism in the Eastern Bloc. Back in the Soviet Union, people were getting frustrated of the one-party system, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time, elections were held in which members of the Communist Party had to run against non-members.
He revoked the Communist Party's special status and handed over state power to the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR, which was the first parliament established by the USSR. And in 1990, Gorbachev became the first president of the USSR. Though he was elected president, much of the power was actually in the hands of his rival, former USSR member, Boris Yeltsin.
In 1991, while Gorbachev was on vacation, communist conservatives kidnapped Gorbachev in a coup to seize power. And Yeltsin, despite being a rival of Gorbachev's, organized a resistance against the coup, and the coup ultimately failed. Gorbachev was released, but many speculated that he planned the coup himself, and the public grew distrustful of him and viewed Yeltsin as a hero.
Yeltsin then set out to dismantle the USSR, making a deal with Ukraine and Belarus, dissolving the USSR. And Gorbachev, whose policies hoped to change the Soviet Union but not destroy it, resigned on December 25, 1991. With him went his hopes of restoring the Soviet Union, and 6 days later, on New Year's Eve, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, ending the threat of nuclear warfare as the Cold War came to a close.
Though he resigned, Gorbachev remains fairly active to this day, writing books and participating in interviews. In 1990, Gorbachev, still as president, won the Nobel Peace Prize for the reforms he made in the Soviet Union.
And so in the end, Gorbachev ended the Soviet Union in hopes for a better country and a better future. He could not allow the war to happen because of him, and believes firmly to this day that stepping down was his own victory. And so there you have it, decades of tension and the powerful Soviet Union, all crushed by Mikhail Gorbachev, whose reforms and policies destroyed himself and his country, but not before it changed the earth forever.